I'd like to introduce Mark Lethbridge from Ecoknowledge. Mark will be our first speaker in this afternoon's session.
Thanks for that. I'm representing Flinders University, in fact, today, who've put in kind into their contribution, along with quite a few others, to the monitoring and evaluation component of the project. Particularly, though, I'd also like to acknowledge Keith Salford and Glenn Edwards, who were on the Geodatabase Committee with me, and for which I'm reporting to you now. All right, so I'm just going to talk about three areas that were part of the monitoring, the satellite tracking, and what we've learnt from that. Let's bear in mind this was not a research project. NINTI-1 were undertaking a management project. Now, inevitably, for the purpose of monitoring the progress of the project, we've also learnt a lot, and that's what I want to focus on. Learned a lot about habitat utilisation, using Judas collars to find animals. I want to talk about the aerial surveys to use to monitor changes in the population, the distribution, which has also been used for removal planning, and decision support tools I'll briefly touch on towards the end. Satellite tracking, seeing the collars. What you don't know is we've learned a lot about where camels are found, and combined with aerial survey data, this is the tri-state border, the purple lines you see on towards the right. The crosses there are just a summary of camel activity in that area, and what is very obvious and statistically significant is that the camels are spending more time in the clay swale areas than they are in the dune systems. Now that'll be seasonally dependent somewhat, but and you talk with any operators on the ground, like Lexi's group and Matt Jensen and others, they'll say, well, we already knew that, Mark. But what we can't do is generalise across the landscape, because in the Simpson Desert, the movement and the location of the animals are very, very different. They follow the north-south direction of the more recent historical dunes, so these dunes are quite peaked. If anyone's driven the Simpson Desert, driving east and west is difficult, north and south is easier. And so the camels are following very different movement patterns to the tri-state border. Now this sort of data, and I'll talk about it later, has been invaluable for, and this is on the SA side principally, although no, they're crossing into NT here, but for the SA government, the use of Judas collars has been invaluable for their planning. And that's just a more smooth, if you like, stylised version of some of the movement. That's one particular individual. I've taken out all the little jumps in it. Huge distances. This is from SA government, but they looked at the tracking hotspots as part of their decision making in terms of where they're going to cull and put their resources. But they also used reconnaissance flights and aerial survey data as well. So intelligence is gathered from a range of sources, and these are only one or two of those sources I'm showing you today. I want to talk about the contract with the federal government was about 9 key asset areas, which I've shown there in sort of the green patches, but some are quite small and a bit insignificant out on the periphery. But obviously where the camel hotspots are from the map, you can see West MacDonald Range and the Petermans and Dalhousie, to a lesser degree Hay River, are all in those hotspots. Now, as part of the project design, there was a heavy focus on removing camels in a 100-kilometre buffer around those assets. This is also where aerial surveys were focused, and you can see the hatching of some of the aerial surveys. Some of those are very early aerial surveys to the north. I've put all on there, not just the recent stuff. But the whole country's not covered in aerial surveys, because it would have cost the entire NINTI budget line to do an aerial survey of the whole country, you've got to understand. So we were limited by the 10% MERI limits put on us by the federal government. And so it had to be focused around those core assets. That's the key. And as a result, we've got quite accurate data. That's looking out from an aerial survey. Actually, I'm not going to talk about that today. I think because I know where we're going to head today, so I think I'll cut to the chase. And it may be hard to follow these tables, but we've got good data on the densities and abundance in those 50 kilometre buffer areas around those assets and the 100 kilometre, because we've got aerial surveys, and where the aerial surveys weren't quite covering the whole buffer area, we used this thing called krigging, which all of you have heard, to try to do some interpolation, extrapolation from that. The before and afters definitely show a drop in the density of camels. But did it agree with the culling? So just some basic figures, because there's quite a few people that don't have a lot of confidence around this for some odd reason. But the population 2008, and I'm going to talk about that figure because obviously that's raised some eyebrows recently, but the population 2008, just in those 100 kilometre buffer areas, 208,000. Population 2013, that is 69 is the current estimate, right? That's 139,000 that have dropped. I'm going to talk about population growth rate because we've seen a plunge in the animals recently, and so at the moment we don't believe there has been an increase. What increases might have happened early on the project have certainly decreased dramatically towards the end of the project from natural attrition. But the known removals in that buffer area are 123,000. We've done the math, we've worked out how many were in, and in the case of aerial culling, precisely down to the GPS position, how many were actually in that 100 kilometre buffer and how many were out. So there's been a 58.9% loss. Now, if you look at the comparison between the two aerial surveys, that's 139,000. You look at how many are known removal. There are only 16,000 camels unaccounted for in that. That's pretty good going, given how mobile they are. However, I turn to the national figure. Look, the aerial surveys were targeted changes of densities around the assets. There's no question of that. There's much greater uncertainty of camel densities well away from the survey areas, although we've got, NINTI have got a lot of landholder anecdotal evidence of what the likely camel densities are further away. So we're not that uncertain, but we haven't mathematically modelled that explicitly, the landholder reports. What I want to talk about is that there's been significant developments in terms of the methodological techniques that we now use to estimate camel numbers. And you've got to bear in mind that there's a lot of uncertainty in those areas where there are not aerial surveys. That's the 2008 map. It's these areas where we have a lot of uncertainty because we didn't conduct aerial surveys there. And in the latest map, the same again. There were fewer aerial surveys because we weren't going to go right out to the edge on limited money and do an aerial survey of nothing. Obviously, they had to target the removal areas. So having said that though, we have improved the methods. And the new methodological development in this area and a revisiting of some of our assumptions, I'm going to talk about one of those, which is population growth rate, led to the Northern Territory Government staff revisiting the 2008 estimate. And in their recent review for the 2008 estimate using the new methods and some knowledge we now have that we didn't have in hindsight, they've revised that to just over 600,000. Now, this is what the media's picked up on as if it's some sort of problem, but look, that's the reality of what happens when you learn through a project, you get better at these estimates. And this was independently validated, by the way, so it's been checked. Now, one assumption prior to the commencement of the project was that camels were increasing at 9 or 10% per annum, and that's in the published literature. And it's based on, some reasonably good data, but we're better at it now. We've got more information. We now think that could be as low as 5%, because what we've observed is massive attrition of camels given drought conditions. And what we hadn't thought about before was the role of fire. And there have been 2 quite large wildfire burns across the hotspots of camels in Australia. One in the Simpson, and one in South Australia and the Pitjantjatjara lands, going up into the NT, if I believe. So the 2008 estimate and the 2011 estimate were both based on that 10% growth assumption. Now we know that's not the case. And it is the subject of future research, but it's not an NT-funded research project, like I said. So there will be many eyes on that growth rate trying to revise that figure for publication. And it needs to get into the literature. So, but we have seen huge losses, I said, in the Simpson Desert. We've observed that directly. And there was a huge fire that came up through and into the Pitjantjatjara lands. And there were inevitable losses there, and we saw a lot of animals in ill condition as a result of no food after that fire. So we do think there's been a large drop more recently from natural attrition, and that's not just from modelling, I'm talking about people on the ground. So the 2008 estimate, improved now, it should have a greater than sign in front of it. It's greater than 600,000, okay? But it's certainly not around 1 million. The 2013 estimate now, using an improved technique that we have a lot more confidence in, is 300,000 to 400,000, but in the media it's been quoted at the conservative end at the moment at 300,000. I work out early 300s, so it's a question whether you round down or you put the range in. We'll get careful with communications on that, but I'm just telling you that it's in that range. I'm reasonably confident now from what we've done. It's unlikely we've had a net population growth over the period of the project, okay, with this recent fire and drought conditions. So the 600,000, we know 160,000 have been removed from muster and culling. That leaves 440,000 if you just took one off the other. So we have unaccounted for 40 to 130,000 animals. We don't. That's the uncertainty that I was telling you about in terms of the greater population. But let's be clear, inside the buffer areas where there are aerial surveys, we've only got 16,000 camels, 1/6 unaccounted for. So we've got a lot more confidence when you're close to an aerial survey than when you're far from it. And after all, that was the target set by NINTI, was those buffer areas. So I think we've got reasonably good monitoring data there. Quickly, and I'll be very quick. What's my time like? I've got 5 to go. That's good. I did well. Quickly, I'll just talk about some other things that we've all benefited from. We had a workshop, we've had a couple of workshops. SA hosted one for their aerial marksman team. And one of the, I think, and I don't want to speak on behalf of all the aerial marksmen that are here, but I think it was a very fruitful workshop, getting all of the aerial marksmen together from all the jurisdictions. And a lot of ideas were shared. Number one rule, I think, of the moment was always, how can we keep the animal welfare standards high? Every one of those shooters were determined to maintain and possibly increase that standard. But we also talked about efficiencies in terms of how they were finding animals, where they were going, their search techniques. And there were a lot of very different ideas because between the jurisdictions there was a lot of different land systems, and therefore the techniques changed. And so we were able to study, these are culls in the Simpson, the yellow dots, the red lines are where they flew. We're able to look at that in more detail. This is another one, Northern Territory. The blue shading underneath, by the way, is the aerial survey data showing the hotspots. And you can see they're primarily focusing on those hotspots from local knowledge, and these maps obviously help as well. But trying to bring that together, I don't want to talk about that, but trying to bring that together, what we did is we created a simulation model that started to explore whether there were more efficient ways they could deliver that. So this was an eco-fiscal model. We're not talking now about just ecological models, but actually building a financial model into the ecological model, because that's what we're talking about with camels. And for muster, there's the chain of supply fiscal side of it as well. It would be looking at distances and a whole range of things. So I don't want to talk too much on this decision tool, except to say that one of the advantages with it is that before they even go out to undertake these removal operations, these tools can provide, with the intelligence data they gather, these tools can start to provide them with a sense of how much it's going to cost, how long it's going to take, and what they're likely to get in terms of uptake. So the cost per head, if you like, if you want to look at it that way. And so that's not only the communication, the cross-border communication between the aerial marksman teams has been fruitful, but I think we were able to draw on a lot of their knowledge and what we were learning from their data to come up with much more efficient ways that they could deliver those outcomes for obviously the least cost. And these are sorts of curves you can get out of it, like the cost per head, the number culled, and the total costs. So we could start to work out, well, where's the efficiencies in that. All right, thank you very much.